Hello, this is Dr. Michael Drues. In this podcast, I'd like to discuss the differences between intended use and indications for use. Quite frankly, the reason why I'm creating this podcast is because in my nearly 25 years of biomedical engineering and regulatory strategy consulting, I've seen a progressively increasing number of people who seem not to understand the difference between the two, both in industry as well as, quite frankly, at the FDA. And this is really not that complicated. It seems that most people they just don't get it. So the purpose of this podcast is to try to simplify as much as I can why these what these terms are and why the difference is important. So intended use versus indications for use. Are they the same? Are they different? Are they substantially equivalent? Are they bioequivalent? I suppose you have to be sort of a regulatory geek to appreciate my not so subtle use of humor to that. So, first of all, let's start out with the premise, and that is, although intended use and indications for use are similar, they are not the same. Many people use these phrases synonymously. Many people, not only in industry, but also in FDA, I've seen countless times where indication for use and intended use statements are flat out wrong, even in cleared or approved submissions. And quite frankly, there's no reason why that should happen. Intended use and indications for use are both parts of what I call high-level labeling. Now, most people in this audience, I'm sure, appreciate that labeling is a very broad term. When I refer to what I call high-level labeling, I'm specifically referring to the intended use and indication for use statements as well as the product's labels claims. Now, one thing that we should remember when FDA is reviewing a submission, for a medical device or a drug or whatever, the high level labeling, the intended use, and the indications for use, if the FDA reviewers are doing their job, they will parse these statements word for word, letter for letter, punctuation mark for punctuation mark. Other parts of the submission, on the other hand, I've become thoroughly convinced that nobody ever reads. Let's just be honest about it. But the high level labeling is something that FDA reads or should read very carefully. And as a result, for those of us in industry, we should choose very, very carefully not just the words that we use, but how we arrange them and so on. So let's start out with indications for use. The way I like to think about this is on the indications for use, the focus is on the patient, So in other words, what diseases, what injuries, I'm sorry, there's a typo on that slide. It should be what injuries, what conditions, etc. is the product designed to diagnose, treat, cure, mitigate, and so on and so on. So the most important thing to remember about indications for use is that the focus is on the patient. Intended use, on the other hand, the focus is on the product, So what does the device or the drug actually do? If it's a medical device like a stent, I'll use that as an example. A bare metal coronary stent, the indications for use might be coronary atherosclerosis. That's the disease that the patient presents with. The intended use of that bare metal coronary stent is to open the narrowed artery due to the stenosis, and ideally restore blood flow. So that would be the intended use. In some cases, we might want to include the mechanism of action, in other words, how the medical device or drug works, in the intended use statement. There are sometimes advantages and disadvantages to doing that. I won't get into that here, but sometimes that is included the intended use statement. So to recap, indication for use, that focuses on the patient. Intended use, that focuses on the product. Let me, before we end this podcast, offer some additional recommendations when it comes to labeling. This is regulatory strategy. This is nothing that the regulation or the FDA will ever tell you, but this is something that some of us have learned along the way as we play this game, in my case, for nearly 2.5 decades. So my first recommendation on labeling is start very broadly. you want to design your label as broadly as possible. If necessary, we can make the label more specific through the FDA negotiation. So, for example, if you're going to the FDA with a new medical device in a pre-sub meeting, and I highly recommend taking new medical devices to the FDA long in advance of the submission via the pre-sub. I've done other podcasts specifically on the pre-sub process. I want to start with the most broad label, the most broad indication for use statement as I possibly can. If FDA basically says, nice try, but try again, okay, now I will start to narrow it more and more. But I don't want to offer a narrow label to begin with, because if I do, I've lost all of my negotiating power. So start out broadly, you can narrow down if necessary, and be prepared to negotiate. My next recommendation is don't just understand your stated label claims, but your potential inferred or implied label claims. In the world of label claims, I break the universe into two parts: the stated claims and the inferred or the implied claims. Stated claims, in a nutshell, are the claims that we state in black and white on our label, and as a result, those are the claims that we're required to prove. Inferred or implied label claims, on the other hand, those are not stated on our label, but pretty much everybody knows that that product can do whatever it is that is being inferred or implied. I love to take advantage of inferred or implied label claims because, first of all, I don't have to do anything to support them. So it really makes my regulatory burden in getting my product onto the market, whether it's a medical device or a drug or a combination product or a biologic, it doesn't make any difference. So I love to take advantage of inferred or implied label claims when I can. Now, officially, pardon me, FDA will say that they are not keen on inferred or implied label claims. And perhaps that's true. However, the simple reality is there are just far too many products on the market, devices as well as drugs, where we take advantage of inferred or implied label claims all the time. Now, one thing to be aware of, what I'm talking about here in terms of taking advantage of inferred or implied label claims, it's one thing to do this from a regulatory strategy, but as we'll talk about in a moment, one of the things that we have to also take into account is reimbursement. So while FDA, although they'll never publicly admit it, they're okay with inferred or implied label claims, CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the folks that determine reimbursement, are not. So this is why we have to design our labels not just very carefully from a regulatory perspective, but also from a reimbursement perspective. My next recommendation in terms of labeling is design your labeling, especially the high-level labeling, just like you design the product. I was in California recently working with a medical device company who currently has a medical device under development, and we designed 5 or 6 different indication for use statements, all describing exactly the same product, all describing exactly the same device. And what I did was I presented to the senior management of the company a regulatory burden assessment and a regulatory risk assessment on each of those 5 or 6 different indication for use statements. In other words, if you say this is what we're going to have to do, and this is our likelihood of success of getting it through the FDA. If, on the other hand, we say that, this is what we're going to have to do, and this is our likelihood of success of getting it through the FDA. And I presented this to the senior management, and we had a discussion as to what the company wanted to say about their particular device. But again, we did not do it just from a regulatory perspective. We also looked at it from a reimbursement perspective, from a product liability perspective, and from some other perspectives as well. Because oftentimes what we want to say from a regulatory perspective is diametrically opposed, 180 degrees out of sync from what we want to say from a reimbursement perspective or a product liability perspective. This is why it truly has to be a team effort. We cannot think of regulatory strategy in isolation. It has to be designed with reimbursement in mind, with product liability in mind, with intellectual property in mind, and so on and so on. So as an engineer, when I design a label, to me, design is design. So it doesn't make any difference if I'm designing a physical widget, if I'm designing a clinical trial, if I'm designing a regulatory submission, or in this case, if I'm designing my high-level labeling. To me, design is design. Choose your words very carefully. Take advantage of label expansions. This is something that we do frequently in the drug world, not quite as much in the medical device world, but I do it all the time. If you want truly the lowest regulatory burden to get your product onto the market, medical devices, but drugs as well, go with the most dumbed down version of the product as you can. And then add more bells and whistles to it as we go later on in the regulatory vernacular. This is what we call a label expansion. Oftentimes, the metaphor that I like to use comes from baseball. So it's the difference between swinging for a home run as opposed to swinging for a single. Everything else being equal, I would much prefer to swing for a home run. That would be like putting all of our bells and whistles in our product to begin with. However, when we swing for a home run, we have a higher likelihood of striking out. In this very risk averse industry that we've evolved into, most companies don't want to take that risk. So instead, we swing for a single. The batter gets to the plate, he swings, he gets a base hit. The runner moves to the batter moves to first base. The next batter comes up, we he gets a base hit. The runner on first moves to second, and so on and so on. At the end of the day, we end up getting around the bases just like in a home run. It's just a matter of doing it in a series of smaller baby steps as opposed to a home run. Of course, there are advantages and disadvantages to both approaches, but I find, especially in today's industry, most companies find it more palatable to take the single approach as opposed to the home run approach. And again, I have many examples that I've described in other podcasts. If you're interested, send me an email. I'll be happy to share some of those with you. Think outside the regulatory box. I hinted about this already. Don't design your labels just for the FDA in mind, but take into account the reimbursement and the CMS, the product liability, and so on and so on. I have seen so many times where companies are penny wise and pound foolish. In other words, they craft their label only with the FDA in mind, only to learn later at a very high price, I might add, that they've really shot themselves in the foot in terms of reimbursement. So we need to design these labels to optimize not just our regulatory strategy, but reimbursement and product liability and so on. And the last bit of advice I wanted to share with you in terms of labeling recommendations is with regard to contraindications. Consider contraindications only as a last resort. I will never offer, I shouldn't say never, but I will rarely offer a contraindication up to the FDA prophylactically. I will only use it as a point of negotiation. It is better, in my opinion, to leave something off the label than it is to put it on the label and say, do not use it this way. But sometimes, in order to get our product onto the market, we might have to do that. All I'm suggesting is don't offer that up prophylactically. Keep that in your pocket. In other words, as I have characterized in many of my other podcasts and public presentations, I characterize the entire relationship between the company and the FDA as a poker game in every sense of the word. And just because somebody understands the rules of poker doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good poker player, and it certainly doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win the game. I want to do everything that I can, legal of course. I don't want to be wearing any orange jumpsuits in order to win that game. And taking that poker metaphor a step further, when I walk into the FDA, I have essentially three sets of cards. One set of cards that I put down at the table prophylactically without even anybody asking, and I say, this is what we've done or this is what we're going to do. A second set of cards that I keep in my pocket, and I will only play them if I need them. In other words, if I go in with a broad label, for example, and FDA says, nice try, but try again. Okay, I'll take out a second card from that second set of cards in my pocket with a slightly more narrow label statement. How about this one? So this is a negotiation. Similarly with the contraindication. That contraindication I would put in that second set of cards as I described. And finally, there's a third set of cards that I keep in my pocket forever. In other words, that is, I can't play even if I wanted to. Maybe the company doesn't have the resources to do it. Maybe the technology doesn't exist to do it, and so on and so on. So when I use this metaphor of describing the company and the FDA relationship as a poker game, I mean that in every sense of the word. This is all about strategy. Yes, of course, the rules, the regulations are important, and you got to know what those are. But to me, that's a given. That's a no-brainer. The strategy is infinitely more important than just simply the regulation. So, bottom line, when it comes to intended use and indications for use in particular, this is not rocket science, but it is a poker game. And as a result, strategy is key. The better you understand these phrases, the better you can use them to your advantage. So, this concludes this short podcast on the differences between intended use and indications for use. Are they the same or are they different? And most importantly, how we can use this to our advantage. My name is Dr. Michael Drues. If you have questions or if there's anything I can do to help, you have my contact information, phone, fax, email, and so on. Please feel free to contact me. Check out my LinkedIn site if you're so inclined. Send me an invitation to connect. I'm happy to help however I can. Thank you very much and good luck.